Hello, Nate Oftley here. This is Ascent Anthropology. Welcome back to part two of George McJunkin and the Folsom Man site. So, this slide here, you see the Folsom Man site. It's a panoramic of the wild horse arroyo where the bones were found. And then you've got a few photographs here of the actual Folsom Man site where George first found the bones. Really beautiful landscape. I mean, as you can see, rolling hills and arroyos. There's junipers, there's some oaks, lots of deer. Saw quite a few deer on the way out there and on the way back. There's antelope, bear. We did not see any bear the day of the trip, but there's definitely a lot of bear sightings out there. So on the left here, you see our guide for that day, Mr. David Eck. And he works for the New Mexico State Land Cultural Resources Office. He gave a great tour, very knowledgeable tour guide for sure, or an archaeologist. So then, at the time the site was discovered, there's this controversy that they speak of, right? But it's pretty much been resolved now, right? But at the time, contemporary thought was that humankind had not inhabited the Americas since about 11,000 before Common Era, or 3,000 years ago, right? But we know now in 2022 that it's definitely pushed back further than that, right? By the Clovis site at 14,000 years ago, the footprints in White Sands that are 20,000 years ago, and who knows what we'll be able to find next year, right? To push humankind in the Americas further back, or somewhere in South America. And then one of the most outspoken against this timeline was Alice Hrdlicka. He just adamantly refused that Native Americans arrived to the Americas any earlier than a few thousand years ago, and he argued that they were too primitive or too obtuse or too barbaric to be able to craft such fine, pieces like the Folsom Point, right? Obviously, he was totally wrong, and but he adamantly refused to believe it. But I guess he's just kind of too stuck in his ways. So the Bison Antiquus. Okay, so think back in time, 12,000 years ago, to the Younger Dryas. The last glacial period was ending. Humankind, we walked along the earth with, megafauna like woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, and Bison Antiquus, right? Which you can see this one here, the second one. And then we weren't on the top of the food chain either, right? So there were saber-toothed tigers, dire wolves, cave bears, to name, one bear of the multiple species of gigantic bear. We had no horses at that point yet in the Americas. We were more than likely we were on foot. I don't think they had skateboards back then, but we do know that humankind's closest companion was dog, right? So they more than likely they did have dogs. The dogs maybe even participated in the hunt, and I think that they could have even potentially, learned a few tricks from wolves. And as far as hunting tactics, that's definitely possible. But so you look at the size difference here, right? So you got to ask, so how could humans back then, with very limited technology and protection and weapons, so how could they have hunted not just one of these bison, but 32 gigantic bison? So it's unlikely that they were domesticated livestock, right? I mean, maybe, but probably not. We know that the bison ate grass and other prairie plant life, but if they're anything like their modern day descendants, they probably weren't herded. It's more likely that they were harried into position, and to harry, basically means to slowly prod or to kind of annoy, to cause movement, to move them into a desired location. And this desired location would be like a strategic position, kind of funneling the bison in between two ravines or in an arroyo, right? Like where George found the bones. And then from the safety of the hills or the cliffs above, then the hunters would be able to engage the bison with spears, rocks, maybe large timber. Maybe they established nets, right? Or maybe they had nets or had some type of traps, right? So sheep to the slaughter, right? But that's how we believe they were able to hunt them, right? So it probably wasn't like this, this illustration, this painting here. Maybe they started out like that, and then they figured it out like, wow, maybe we shouldn't take these bison on head to head, and then slowly change their tactics. Or again, maybe they learned from watching wolves, right, and learning how to harry these bison into position. But to give you an idea of the size of these bison antiquus, so this skeletal reconstruction here is in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. But so bison antiquus, they would grow to 7.5 feet tall, 15 feet long, and they would weigh 3,500 pounds, like a ton and a half. So this bison skeletal reconstruction here, it's actually not one single bison, which when you look at it, you think that comes from one, but they had to piece this together. And so this is actually a combination or reconstruction of the fossilized bones. They had to piece it together of those 32 bison that were discovered at the site to make a full skeleton. But I'd like to read here. There's another interpretation of the site from Mike Schoonover. He wrote this in 2010, and I took this from FolsomVillage.com. A band of about 30 prehistoric humans were traversing the area in fall, most likely headed north to winter in Colorado. The season was deduced from the fact that yearling animals were among those killed. They came upon a herd of bison and proceeded to trap them in an arroyo in preparation for slaughter. The animals in the rear would have been killed first, trapping the animals in front. The hunters would most likely have thrust their spears into the animals from the safety of the rim above the arroyo. It is possible that the spears were thrown, perhaps even with the aid of an atlatl. And that's the general consensus, that these bison were hunted, with distance between the hunters, and the prey, right? So from the safety of the cliffs or hills. And the tools definitely gave the hunters an advantage, right, over other predators. So the Folsom Point is still considered to be the pinnacle of stone tool craftsmanship for two reasons, primarily, I think. Right? But so number one, because of the thickness. Some of these Folsom Points are so thin, they're like 2 to 3 millimeters thick. And this is just great precision. It takes a very skilled napper to be able to get that thin without breaking the point. Second, because of the fluting, which is another kind of advanced napping technique, all right, which we'll try to get into. It's really, I can't do it, but I think I understand how they did it. But so it was really the fluting that gave the Folsom Point its distinctive look, right? So you look at a spear point like this, and you know that that's Folsom, right? Whereas Clovis is a little bit different, and but this one is stylized in that sense, that it's very thin and fluted. So we know that they were more than likely. There's a couple different theories, like a blood channel, or potentially more accuracy, but more than likely the fluting was for hafting to spear shafts, or knife handles, and they did use these for knives as well. They weren't just spear points or arrow points. But yeah, definitely the work of a master craftsman, master napper. Um, Absolutely, for sure. It takes a lot of patience. So how they were actually made, right? Um, it depends on where you look. Some people say there's 11 steps. Some say 7 or 8, but I think you can kind of break it down into these 7 steps here. First, starting off with your initial biface. And what I mean by this is you pick a stone that is close to the size, the shape that you want. You'll actually this, if you start out with a biface rock like this, um, you're actually going to reduce so much material off of that where it's actually going to be significantly smaller, maybe half the size of that after napping it down to a point, right? The second step is biface thinning, right? So you begin to thin it out with the use of bopper or billet, and these were made back then. Today they're made from copper, and I mean we've got a couple different ways of making boppers and billets, but they didn't have copper as far as we know back then, right? So they used a stone, kind of like stone hammers, like rounded, or antler, more than likely, to be able to remove material from the biface. And the way that that's done is kind of by hammering the opposite side, or an opposing platform, right? It's not like you're just scraping the material off. You actually have to chip it off from the opposite side. And so larger pieces of material are removed by biface thinning using boppers, but then you have a more fine method, which is pressure flaking, right? Number 3. So number 3 here, you can see this is after pressure flaking. So pressure flaking is removing smaller flakes of material from the biface, and they probably used the distal end or pointed end of an antler in order to do this. This is a little bit more difficult, I think, from biface thinning because it's just a little bit finer. Then number 4, you've got first flute removal. Okay, and so before you get to this, you actually have to kind of get here first. This is what a fluting platform would look like. Right, so you've got to remove the material. You can use pressure flaking here by creating this platform or this bank, almost like a ramp, where you would strike it right there. And you got to get the angle just right. But once you do, you would strike it, and then on the underside or the opposite side, it would actually create, hopefully, if you did it right, it would create this long flute here. And number 5 is the second flute removal. And usually the second flute is going to be shorter than the initial. I don't know why. Maybe because there's just less material to work with. But it would still be enough to get the job done. Finally, you'd kind of the step 6 and 7 are kind of refining the point. You're retouching the margins, right? So your margins are going to be up towards the beginning, the point. You can see how it gets much sharper as well. And this is done through pressure flaking and getting it as smooth and sharp as possible. And then number 7 is grinding the edge of the base. So what they did there was here where you'd actually put the hafting material or lashing or sinew or whatever type of fibers they use to affix this to the shaft. Obviously, you don't want that to rip or get cut, so they would actually grind down the sides here where it would be fixed to that whatever tool they're using to wield it, right? So, and then if you were successful, you'd end up with a fulsome point, right? That looked basically something like that. All right. So, in conclusion, we talked about George McJunkin, Folsom, New Mexico. Folsom Man Site, Bison Antiquus, and the Folsom Point. And these are my references. I'm running out of time here, but if you got any questions,